We're back, guys, with another war zone. This one is in the Charadon Sector in the Ultima Segmentum. The might of the Death Guard under Typhus the Traveler and Black Legion forces battle against the Imperium's Mechanicum, Knights and Imperial Guard in an onslaught of epic proportions. Let's see what happens.
The Imperium is dying. Worlds of metal and turning wheels. Countless lives bound in chains of lies. United by one certainty. All shall fall and wither and decay. And now, by the will of Abaddon, our War Master, I shall be the herald of that truth. The stars of Charadon shall weep. The machines of Metalica shall rot. And when their forges are cold and their flesh calls out for mercy, I will be there to welcome them.
The Charadon Campaign, also known as the War of Rust and Slime, began after the Noctis Aeterna, when Typhus the Traveler, the herald of Nurgle, and the greatest champion of the Plague God seized his chance to invade the Forge World of Metalica and plunge the Charadon Sector into war, as decreed by Metalica's ruling Fabricator General Kling. Dating for the campaign is localized as the Metalican Circumscribed Chronology (LRC) to circumvent the galaxy-wide chronological inconsistencies since the formation of the Great Rift. This calendar system measures the number of labor rotation cycles on Metalica since the opening of the rift. The first warnings of the coming disaster for the Imperium came in the form of a number of omens. On Heliuta and the Alomax system, a prophet declared doom, only to be silenced by enforcers. On Hive Actorian, on Dorian's Reach, panic erupted after aquifers began to spew gore. On Dakon and the Mabor system, a heretical cult known as They Who Hear the Whispers rose up before being exterminated. On Byzantius, avians were observed flying backwards, while on Fathom, the ocean depths were said to glimmer with strange luminescence. Mutations, plagues, and spontaneous psychic phenomena became widespread sector-wide. The plagues and accompanying plague zombies in particular proved devastating, forcing the excruciators Space Marines to deploy to the astropathic relay system of Cobalt to cleanse the world. Fabricator General Kling sought to keep such disasters under secrecy to avoid a full panic and deployed eradication arcs to scour wars lost to infection, such as Saint Espin's gift. Yet this did not end the series of omens and disasters, and Kling next had his Skitarii reinforce the walls around the Metalica system. Into this cauldron came the Lord Discordant Akorath Zaid, an emissary of Abaddon the Despoiler, securing the assistance of the disdainful Typhus the Traveler through the authority Abaddon represented. Sure, the Death Guard first captain that the machine sterility Metalica represented could be swept away, replaced by the blessings of Nurgle. Typhus saw the machine worshipping tech priests of Metalica as heretics to Nurgle's organic gifts, and had his biologist Petrifiers concoct a plague known as the Nemesis Worm. If delivered into the heart of Metalica, even the mechanical world could be corrupted. Chaos forces began their attack on the Charadon sector with the tri-prong offensive. The first blow came in the Chromede system, link between the Opolis and Karas subsectors. However, they found Imperial defenses were stronger than expected in the region due to Bar's Dark Elder raids by Lilith Hesperax. These forces consisted of the Looms 124th and Savla 88th Zonas, alongside Asketari Marcoclade, led by Marshal Deceter Septrax Tertian. While formidable, these forces were spread out to counter the Xenos Raiders, and the local Death Guard commander Thraxoplasmox was able to exploit this, striking at the world of Okarium as it was being assailed by Dark Eldar Raiders. On the world, the Savlari Imperial Guard conducted a fighting retreat, but were mistakenly annihilated by allied gun servitors after the Xenos eliminated their messengers announcing the withdrawal. This allowed the Death Guard to land in flanking positions and annihilate the Imperials. Darwish's Reach also suffered when it was attacked by a band of Dreadblade Chaos Knights known as the Company Malevolent. The Traitor Knights smashed through BDF defenses and broke open the defenses of several hives before preying upon Imperial supply convoys in the open desert. On the agri world of Tarthusa, 7 Victoriums of the Death Guard marched forward, including the infamous Hollow Ones and Demon Engine packs of the Grisselbus Guard. Yet the Imperial forces here were led by Marshal Tertian himself, and he repeatedly outflanked the Chaos Space Marines. Yet despite a number of small victories, the Imperials could not overcome the Death Guard's supernatural endurance, biological warfare, and numerical superiority. One by one, Cavern Delvers fell to the Chaos forces, and the conflict turned into a costly deadlock. Meanwhile, at the Alumax system, an armada of Death Guard warships and Space Hulks under Oglasmus Bilge struck. Imperial defenders consisted of the 727th Cadian Army Group under Colonel Elena Broski, who calmly organized a defense around St. Bartolph's throne and repelled cultists and Death Guard scouting parties. She also succeeded in getting an astropathic distress call out of Hive Rastigan as the Legio Morbidus fell upon the mining world of Heliuta. With the aid of the local defenders, worker gangs were able to lay several traitor titans low by seeding surface walkings with blasting charges and pitching the machines into the craters. However, in the end, the Imperials had to retreat underground due to attacks by Blight Lord Terminators and the spread of disease. Heliuta fell in less than cycle, as further atrocity followed as Bilge turned his attention to St. Bartolph's throne, which by now saw 2 hive cities ceded to the invaders. Rather than throw more warriors into the fray, Bilge had his warriors board and capture one of the nearby Mechanicum eradication arcs before sending the ship plummeting down onto Hive Rastigan. The resulting impact vaporized the city along with Broski and half of her forces, allowing the Chaos forces to easily advance. Only one factor stopped all of Alumax from being overrun: the orcs of Freebooter Captain Dregbard Skullbuster. The Greenskins ambushed Bilge's fleet at to the Sound, distracting the Chaos forces enough for surviving Imperials to withdraw to the hidden monitor station of Meta Orbital Gamma 4 at the system's edge. Despite the withdrawal and scattered reports of Space Marines reinforcements, for all purposes, the Alumax system had fallen. The largest Chaos Armada encountered thus far next emerged at the Duralim system, where Typhus and the Terminus Est, alongside Lord Zaid, appeared at the head of a massive fleet. After several cycles of sweeping aside defense fleets, the Chaos forces struck at the Hive World of Resplendus. Here, the tri-conjured demon princes, known as the Sistlings, spawned billions of plague zombies. Accompanied by plague marines, the Nurgle armies overran most of its hives in a matter of cycles. The surviving Imperial forces were only able to survive on the highest spires of a number of hives, resupplied through desperate Valkyrie runs. Matters were worse on Magniferia, where due to the machinations of Lord Zaid, the Mechanicum eradication arc Necessity's Ajax struck at the hapless world. The resulting massacre allowed Death Guard and Black Legion forces to land in force. though these were soon confronted by 3 Marcoclades of Skitarii of the Necessities Ajax. However, against these were quickly swept aside by the might of the Chaos Space Marines and accompanying Chaos Knights. By this point, Kling had finally begun to reconcile the reality of the invasions against those of his own predictions. During this time, Imperial commanders had been left to wage the defense virtually unsupported. Reinvigorated, Kling ordered that the Metalican system be protected at all costs, and to this end mobilized the Metalican Gates for war. Consisting of the Rhodia, Byzantius, and Pharaoh systems, these bastions had to be captured before any move on Metalica itself. Many outlying systems were abandoned, leaving the hapless Imperial populations to their own fate. In some places, Imperial Guard, Sisters of Battle, and Space Marines refused the order to withdraw and continued to fight on. In the crewmate system, the event became known as Kling's betrayal, while at Torthuza, the defending regiments were butchered. Darich's Reach, meanwhile, saw mass slaughter as one hive garrison after another attempted to surrender to the Chaos Knights of the Company Malevolent. At Cromede, remaining resistance gathered at the Death World of Sapira, where survivors waged a guerrilla war that drove off multiple heretic war bands. As the Metalican gates were fortified, scattered Imperial forces continued to fight on at the Duralim system. Here, the Excruciators and Allied Chapter launched purge teams of aggressors and inceptors to strike at the demonic artillery, hammering Hive Kanzelgar. Captain Tanilu led his veteran 1st Company in a mass drop assault on the city's spire, reinforcing the Vostorian regiments on the verge of collapse. They then swept down into the zombie-choked hive below, purging wherever they went. At the Agri World of Sustis, a combined force of Ultramarines, Raven Guard, and other chapters fell upon demon engine packs. Despite these displays of defiance, Typhus's armies continued to advance, and the Traveler himself led the final assault against Fort Kanscaris on Magniferia. On the Penal World of Oplic, Typhus's forces triggered a mass uprising while unleashing the plagues that saw the mass spawning of miasmic malignifiers. Meanwhile, Lord Zaid appeared on Sustis and unleashed a flock of hell drakes that slowed the Imperial counterattack with constant raids. It was at this moment that Typhus now turned his attention to the Metalican gates proper, unleashing the great unclean one Ratigus onto the Pharaoh and Byzantius systems, bypassing Battle Fleet Charadon and the Metalican fleets. Demons spawned throughout the region. As demonic invasion surged across the Metalican gates, Ratigus himself appeared on the ocean world of Fathom in the Pharaoh system. After cycles of oily rain that thickened its seas into an algae-clotted sludge, strains of parasitic plagues erupted amongst the human population. A massive maw appeared at the system of Fathom's northern oceans, and from this, Ratigus and the armies of Nurgle marched forth. A desperate defense began on Fathom as Bilge struck at the fortress world of Forthas in the system. At the Battle of the Philadia Sound, Bilge's forces swept aside the void defenses of Fortharas and bombarded the world from orbit. 2 of the 3 Metalican gates were now under attack. At Byzantius, Metalican forces including the Iron Skull's Titan Legion managed to hold strong on the capital of Capstan against a second Plague Company attack. However, Rodio still remained mostly untouched. The situation, however, changed dramatically as a reinforcement fleet from the Forge Moon Demos, led by Archmagos Ochulto Lau alongside a strike cruiser of the Grey Knights, emboldened Lieutenant Heraldus Charadon of Battle Fleet Charadon launched an offensive into the Pharaoh and Cromate systems, as reports began to appear that the Grey Knights were purging not only the demonic but those who had witnessed them. Charadon's attack was successful in forcing Bilge's fleet to retreat, which became a rout after his ships were caught between an Imperial flotilla and Orc raider fleet in the Forvian Nebula. In the resulting battle, Burge himself was slain when his flagship was destroyed by Orc kill cruisers. It was in the Duralim system, however, that the greatest blow fell. It was at this moment that Typhus's Ward Bearers and Alpha Legion allies betrayed him, as both he and Lord Zaid found themselves caught out of position by a sudden onslaught of knights of House Raven. Typhus became inundated with bad news. Alexesto had been retaken in less than 10 cycles by House Raven, while on Resplendus, the Chaos Siege was broken by Knights and Space Marines. During the battle for Saint Boudica's Sanctum, the Sistlings were slain by Chapter Master Tanilon and Chief Librarian Iwano of the Excruciators Chapter. Furthermore, the Griffonica spaceport and all of its surrounding bastions were back in Imperial hands. On the agri-world of Sustis, the Legio Metalica and the Principes Grevan led a counterattack against the fortress, during which Lord Zaid vanished. Despite this, however, Typhus did not care if the Metallican gates fell, instead simply seeking to keep the enemy occupied as he undertook the last stage of his plan. He ordered a full retreat to the Alomax system, abandoning the fading demonic legions, chaos cults, and other scattered war bands. Meanwhile, on the mining world Daku, the Ward Bearers under Sarkanath and the Alpha Legion under Yaron Thale combined their forces into the Disciples War Band to undertake their own objective. After initiating cult uprisings across the Cyclus system and Mapor system, the War Band made their move on Daku, making planetfall in cooperation with rising cultist forces. However, instead of being welcomed as their masters, the cultists instead opened fire on the Chaos Space Marines. These were not the expected Chaos cultists, but rather Gene-Stealer cultists of the cult of the Inner Worm. After the initial shock of the ambush, the Disciples counterattacked, undertaking rituals that trapped thousands of Gene-Stealer cultists within the Okaro Consortium and hunted to extinction by cornered demons. Alpha Legion assets, meanwhile, took over the Walls' Vox network and used it to outmaneuver and defeat the Gene-Stealer cultists of the Rasa Consortium. The Warband was also able to capture several generators, which cut off the cult from their main source of power. However, the cult of the Inner Worm launched its own counter-defense in turn, unleashing Bureau-trained Gene-Stealers to launch ambushes as their main forces stood their ground, overwhelming attacks. The Disciples found resistance stiffest at the Daku core works, where they fought the Inner Worm's elite in a mishmash of temples and architect tunnels. Despite the fierce battle, the Warband were close to their prize. After more heavy fighting that saw Dark Apostle Sarkonath summon a Keeper of Secrets known as Lestotia the Sinuous, the Disciples captured the Gene-Stealer Patriarch for Sire Glot for their own nefarious reasons. For 100 cycles, the defenders of the Obelisk sub-sector held out against all hardships. They now saw a time to press the advantage, but instead of uniting and pressing on as one Imperial leadership, instead fractured as they pursued their own agendas and committed decentralized actions. Thanks to the efforts of the Sapiran Swords, the entire Krumid front had been deadlocked for 30 cycles, and Imperial forces waged a guerrilla war. Thraxoblasmox could not root out the Imperials and had committed much of his forces to the death world of Sapera. Under Archmagus Lau, the Demos Mechanicum were launching a powerful counterattack, but still stinging from Kling's betrayal. The Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy were reluctant to support them. At Byzantius and Pharaoh, the defenders focused on consolidation. Byzantius was still plagued by lingering Chaos forces, and at Capstan, a Chaos Space Marine army under Garax the Shatterer dug themselves into the Amalurian Trench sprawl near the Equatorial Siege Belt, battling Imperial Guard elements of the Casticorian 88th, Orvari 13th, and Belorian 110th. The Iron Skulls, meanwhile, diverted themselves from the Duralum system in order to break the deadlock. The Pharaoh system had been hit hardest of all, and now the world was suffering from inquisitorial purges against opposed malefic elements. Despite this, defenders in both systems reported seeing new Death Guard structures such as miasmic malignifiers appearing like fungus in every underhive and wasteland. The Duralum system was most prepared to send pursuit after Chaos forces, for here Princeps Griffon and the Knights of House Raven stood ready alongside surviving Space Marines, Sisters of Battle, and Imperial Guard. Griffon waited for permission from Kling to begin his own counterattack, but no word was forthcoming as the Archmagos once again became paralyzed by logic loops and obsession over minutiae. It was Chapter Master Tanelu who at last lost patience and conducted his own last stand at Alumax without Mechanicum support, gathering elements from the Ultramarines, Sons of Medusa, Iron Knights, Obsidian Jaguars, and others in Strike Force Scourge. The Chapter Master struck against St. Bartov's throne and Borthrius. The Marines faced overwhelming numbers and were reduced to hit and run tactics, but discovered that Chaos forces were undertaking a grand ritual. Meanwhile, Typhus sat in prayer for 7 days and learned that Lord Zaid not only lived but had betrayed him. Vowing to take his vengeance in time, Typhus also gleaned arcane lore towards a coming grand ritual. He gathered his first Blade Company elite as well as other 6 Victoriums and struck at Meta Obol Gamma 4, a last bastion of Imperial resistance in the Scythian Grave Reefs. Forewarned by Chief Librarian Iwano, Tanelu redoubled the efforts of his strike force and sought to reinforce Meta Obol Gamma 4, but were not able to arrive before the Blake fleet swept aside what meager Imperial naval resistance was stationed there. Only the Raven Guard under Lieutenant Sadiu was able to launch a delaying action against the Death Guard. Landing from the Terminus Est, Typhus then oversaw the last implantation of his malignifiers, and as they took root, the star-spanning network of corruption constructed by the Death Guard was completed. A massive hurricane of rot and ruin emerged on St. Bartov's throne, while Iano and his elite veterans defended Trauma's bridge against Ratagus himself. Some of the Space Marines stood, but many others fled, and the entire planet was soon consumed by decay. Typhus's ritual soon spread throughout the entire sector, with many planets seeing the dead rise up to fight again for Nurgle. Imperial forces throughout the entire war zone became overwhelmed by this wave of fresh enemy reinforcements. Meanwhile, at the ruins of St. Bartov's throne, the planet was replaced by a massive warp rift leading directly to Metalica itself. The ritual had completely turned the tide of the conflict back into the hands of the forces of chaos. Only defenders in the Rodeo system had breathing space, and these were already in transit in the warp and unaware of what had just transpired, and could not be recalled to reinforce Metalica. Typhus gathered his forces and began his grand assault upon Metalica. Now that the way to the Metalica system is open, Typhus finally unleashes the full might of his forces upon the Forge World itself. How will the Imperium's defenders react to this sudden change of events? Will the Traveler claim his prize, or maybe the defenders will have another say? And that's what we'll find about in our next video, so don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned.